In the dying years of the 1st century before Christ, Rome stood astride the known world like a colossus. From the shimmering deserts of Egypt to the mist-veiled cliffs of Britannia, from the marble streets of Athens to the dusty hills of Judea, the eagle standards of the Roman legions marched unchallenged. Augustus, the first emperor, basked in triumph, proclaiming that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But beyond the Rhine, in the dark and endless forests of Germania, there stretched a land that resisted the Roman grasp. It was a place of shadows, of thick canopies blotting out the sun, of marshes and bogs where the ground itself seemed to swallow men whole. Here, in this untamed wilderness, would unfold a catastrophe so devastating that it would echo through history as Rome's darkest day. For centuries afterward, the very name of the Teutoburg forest would chill the blood of Roman commanders, whispered as a warning of hubris and overreach. For it was here, in the year 9 AD, that 3 Roman legions, numbering nearly 20,000 men, hardened veterans of empire, were led into a trap by those they trusted, and butchered almost to the last man. This was no mere defeat. It was a massacre, a humiliation so profound that Augustus himself was said to tear his robes and cry out into the night, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Yet to understand how such a catastrophe came to pass, one must look not only to the battle itself, but to the years of tension that preceded it, to the clash of cultures between the disciplined order of Rome and the fierce independence of the Germanic tribes. The Romans saw Germania as a frontier that must be tamed, a wild expanse that stood as both a threat and a prize. But to the tribes who dwelled there, the Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Marsi, and countless others, Rome was an intruder, an arrogant foreigner seeking to bind free men with chains. And it was among these tribes that a man would rise, one of their own, who would play the part of both ally and traitor, servant and liberator. His name was Arminius, and it was he who would lead the Germans to victory in the shadows of the Teutoburg forest. The story begins with Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man entrusted with the governance of the newly annexed German provinces. Varus was no hardened general, but a politician, a bureaucrat steeped in the traditions of Roman law. He believed that Germania could be ruled as easily as Syria or Gaul, that the tribes could be brought to heel through taxation and decrees. Yet he misunderstood the soul of the Germans, for they were not a people who bent easily to foreign laws. Their allegiances shifted with the seasons, their loyalty bound to kinship and clan, not empire. Still, Varus imposed Roman order with heavy hands, extracting tribute, enforcing edicts, and expecting compliance. At his side, advising him and winning his trust, was Arminius, a young chieftain of the Cherusci tribe. Raised in Rome as a hostage during his youth, Arminius had been educated in Latin, trained in Roman military discipline, and even granted the prestigious rank of equestrian. To Varus, he was a symbol of Rome's success in civilizing the barbarians. To his own people, however, he remained a son of Germania, a wolf cloaked in Roman armor. He saw with clear eyes the arrogance of Rome, the weakness of Varus, and the festering anger of the tribes. And he began to weave a plan that would change the fate of nations. The forest loomed ever present in this tale. To the Romans it was a place of dread, an endless maze where legions could lose themselves, where unseen enemies lurked behind every tree. To the Germans it was a sanctuary, a protector, and an ally. Its roots, tangled and deep, hid paths known only to them. Its marshes swallowed horses, its rains turned roads to rivers of mud, and its canopy muffled sound, cloaking ambushes until the first spear struck home. In this setting, Arminius whispered to the tribes, calling them to unity with promises of vengeance and freedom. One by one, the chieftains listened, and in secret councils beneath the moon, they pledged to strike. Meanwhile, Varus prepared for a march that would take his army deeper into the wilds than ever before. It was late in the campaigning season when storms were gathering and the earth turned treacherous. Reports of unrest in distant villages reached him, cleverly planted by Arminius himself. The young chieftain counseled him to act swiftly, to march with his legions and put down the rebellion before it spread. Trusting his loyal ally, Varus agreed, and so began the fatal journey. The columns stretched for miles, 20,000 soldiers, auxiliaries, camp followers, wagons laden with supplies, families trailing behind the eagle standards. Armor clinked, hooves struck against wet soil, and the heavy carts groaned beneath the strain. They were not prepared for war, but for administration, their minds set on quelling villages, not fighting armies. And as the rain began to fall, as thunder rolled across the skies, they entered the forest that would become their grave. The Germans watched from the shadows. Warriors painted their bodies, sharpened their spears, and readied their bows. Arminius, who had slipped away under the pretext of gathering allies, now rode among them, a figure half Roman, half barbarian, calling them to courage. His voice carried through the trees, reminding them of Roman cruelty, of taxes, of executions, of dishonored gods. He spoke of freedom, of vengeance, and of destiny. The time had come to strike, and the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening to his words. The ambush began not with a trumpet, but with silence. The legionaries trudged through the mud, the rain beating down upon their helmets, their formations stretched and broken by the terrain. Suddenly, the trees erupted with a storm of spears. From every side came the war cries of the tribes, shrill and fierce, echoing through the dripping branches. Roman soldiers fell, pierced through their shields, toppled from horses, trampled beneath wagons. The legions tried to rally, but the forest offered no ground for discipline, no space for their iron formations. Cohesion dissolved into chaos, and chaos turned to slaughter. For 3 days the massacre continued, the Romans driven deeper into despair, cut down as they sought escape, crushed by the very earth that had betrayed them. The eagles of the legions, sacred standards that embodied the soul of Rome, were seized by the enemy, torn from dying hands. The proud army of Varus was annihilated, its remnants hunted like beasts through the undergrowth. At last, surrounded and broken, Varus himself fell upon his sword, preferring death to capture. His officers followed suit, their blood mingling with the rain-soaked soil. When news of the disaster reached Rome, disbelief turned to horror. The empire that seemed invincible had suffered a wound so deep it shook the foundations of power. Augustus raged and wept, tearing at his clothes, haunted by the thought of lost legions. The Rhine frontier collapsed into panic, with forts abandoned, settlements destroyed, and survivors fleeing westward. Germania, once thought ripe for conquest, was lost. The Romans would return, yes, but never again would they dream of annexing the land beyond the Rhine. The shadow of Teutoburg endured, a scar on the pride of Rome. The horror of Teutoburg was not merely in the loss of men, but in the manner of their death. The Romans, trained to fight in open fields with clear lines and rigid formations, found themselves disoriented in the twisting trails of the forest. Mud sucked at their boots, fallen branches tore at their armor, and the cacophony of war cries and clashing steel disoriented their senses. Soldiers who had faced the Parthian cavalry or the desert sands of Africa now confronted an enemy that struck like shadows, invisible until the last moment. Spear met shield, arrow pierced flesh, and the ground itself became a weapon, funneling men into ambush points, bogs, and ravines where even the strongest could not survive. Arminius watched from hidden ridges, his mind a map of destruction. The young chieftain, who had once dined with Varus and learned the secrets of Roman order, now directed the chaos with precision. Every feint, every lure into marshes, every cutting off of a Roman column was deliberate. He moved like a phantom among his people, appearing where needed, rallying warriors, encouraging the trapped Romans to despair. There was no cruelty in him beyond strategy. He fought not as a monster, but as a son of Germania reclaiming his homeland. Yet his understanding of Rome's pride allowed him to exploit their weaknesses with devastating effect. Stories of the battle spread quickly through the tribes. In villages and meadows, elders recounted how Rome's might had been shattered by cunning and courage. Children were told of the day when the invaders who thought themselves gods among men were humbled by forests and spears. Arminius became not just a chieftain, but a symbol, a legend whose name would echo across generations. His victory was both practical and psychological. The Germanic tribes, long divided, now shared a sense of unity and purpose. Rome, in contrast, was forced to confront the limits of its reach, the vulnerability of even its proudest legions. Yet the aftermath in Rome was no less dramatic. Augustus, the architect of the empire, was haunted by the disaster. Reports reached him slowly at first, fragmented messages of legions trapped, eagles lost, and officers slain. Panic spread through the capital. Priests proclaimed omens of doom. Temples burned incense to appease angry gods. The Senate convened in haste, voices raised in fear and fury. Rome's borders had never seemed more fragile, and whispers of revolt, foreign gods, and restless provinces threatened to unravel the web of order Augustus had so carefully woven. The surviving Roman soldiers were a ragged remnant, haunted by the forest, by the screams of comrades, and by the realization that their civilization, so confident in its permanence, could bleed as any other. They would speak in hushed tones of the betrayal, of Arminius's dual loyalty, and of the forest itself, which seemed to have conspired with the tribes. Every mile westward was a struggle against memory, against fear, against the knowledge that their defeat was total. Rome's response, however, was inevitable. It would not forget, nor forgive. Generals were dispatched in force to secure the Rhine frontier, to rebuild forts, and to prevent any further incursions into the empire. Campaigns of revenge followed, brutal and unrelenting, as Rome sought to punish the tribes and restore its reputation. Yet even in victory, Rome learned humility. The forests of Germania remained largely unconquered. The empire that had spanned continents would never again dream of fully subduing the lands beyond the Rhine. Teutoburg had marked a boundary, not of stone, but of fate itself. The psychological impact of the battle reverberated beyond military strategy. Artists, poets, and historians would later capture its magnitude, interpreting the loss as both tragedy and cautionary tale. In Rome, the eagles taken by the Germans became sacred symbols, objects of shame to be reclaimed at great cost. And in Germania, songs and legends immortalized Arminius, framing him as both warrior and liberator, a figure whose cunning and courage had humbled the mightiest empire of the age. The forest itself became a character in history, a living entity that had absorbed the blood, the screams, and the desperation of men, and through them, had sealed its place in myth. The day of the ambush was etched into the calendars of both Rome and Germania. In Rome, anniversaries were observed with solemnity, a reminder of the price of arrogance and the limits of human power. In Germania, celebrations honored freedom, the cunning of a single man who had united many and the land that had shielded them. History would remember the event not merely as a defeat, but as a pivotal moment, a turning point where the ambition of empire met the will of the wild. Yet even as centuries passed, questions lingered. Could Varus have seen the betrayal in time? Could Rome have adapted its tactics to the forested terrain? Could the empire have survived differently had the legions not marched blindly into the trap? Historians ponder these questions, but the forest itself keeps its secrets. The whispers of trees and bogs carrying tales of heroism, folly, and blood. In contemplating Teutoburg, one is reminded that history is not written solely by victories. Sometimes it is the disasters that illuminate the character of men, the resilience of societies, and the enduring tension between civilization and nature. The blood-soaked trails of that fateful forest tell a story of betrayal, strategy, and the enduring struggle for freedom. They speak to the eternal human drama where pride meets humility, where preparation confronts cunning, and where empires, no matter how mighty, can fall to the earth itself. And so the forest waits still, centuries later, silent in its majesty, a witness to the clash of gods, men, and destiny. The legions are gone, the generals dead, but the story of that dark day survives, whispered in wind through the leaves, a cautionary tale for all who would dare to conquer lands they do not understand. Teutoburg is not merely a battlefield, it is a testament, a legend, a mirror reflecting both the power and fragility of human ambition. The first day of the ambush was a study in chaos. The Romans, disciplined and confident, had marched in long columns, their shields polished, standards high, and armor gleaming even beneath the gray, rain-filled skies. But the forest did not allow order. Narrow paths funneled the legions into vulnerable positions, horses slipped in the mud, and wagons carrying supplies became obstacles that split formations and slowed movement. From hidden positions among the trees, the Germans unleashed volleys of arrows that cut through shields and helmets alike. The sound was a storm, metal striking wood, men screaming, horses neighing in terror. Varus attempted to restore order, shouting commands over the din, but discipline faltered under the weight of the forest and the sudden, relentless assault. Auxiliary troops tried to flank, but marshes and ravines swallowed them. Roman engineers, skilled in building roads and fortifications, found themselves helpless against terrain that could not be tamed by tools or skill. Every step forward was measured in blood, every attempt at formation punished by unseen enemies, striking from every angle. Arminius orchestrated the attack with chilling precision. From his vantage points, he signaled warriors to concentrate pressure at key points, isolating the legions in pockets of death. Scouts reported on movements, and sudden charges shattered Roman cohesion. Each village they passed had been emptied, burned, or turned into traps, as if the forest itself conspired with the tribes. The Romans, trained for siege and open battle, could not adapt to this new form of warfare, a war dictated by shadows, mud, and the intimate knowledge of the land. As night fell, the surviving Romans sought to establish a camp. Exhausted, drenched, and demoralized, they dug trenches and pitched tents, believing that darkness might grant them respite. But the forest allowed no rest. Fires set in distant clearings illuminated fleeting shapes, and the night rang with war cries that echoed like the cries of ghosts. Sleep was impossible, fear was omnipresent. Those who had survived the day's slaughter spent the night tending the wounded and mourning the dead, knowing that tomorrow would bring another onslaught. The second day intensified the nightmare. Arminius had anticipated Roman attempts at retreat. Narrow paths and hidden marshes turned the legions into prey. Romans fell into bogs, horses floundered, and wagons piled atop one another in collapse. Arrows rained from trees, spears struck from every direction. The Romans attempted to form defensive lines, but the ground itself betrayed them. Soldiers were separated from their cohorts, officers killed trying to rally men, and communication became impossible. Every decision had to be made with fragments of information, every movement a gamble with life itself. Stories from survivors would later describe the surreal terror of the battle. Men claimed they could not see the enemy clearly. The Germans appeared and vanished like spirits. Rain poured relentlessly, turning armor and leather to useless weight, filling trenches with mud and blood. Some soldiers, exhausted and hungry, wandered into enemy lines by mistake, only to meet sudden death. Discipline gave way to desperation. Courage was all that remained, though even it was often insufficient against the methodical brutality of Arminius's trap. By the third day, the battle had become a fight for mere survival. Varus, recognizing the hopelessness, resolved to die with honor rather than fall alive into enemy hands. He fell on his sword, and those officers who could followed him, a grim testament to Roman ideals of honor and loyalty. The remainder of the legions either perished or were scattered, hunted relentlessly. The forest, once silent and indifferent, now seemed alive with menace, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential killer. In the aftermath, the Germans celebrated, but did so with reverence for their homeland. They understood that the victory was not only in bloodshed, but in reclaiming freedom from an empire that sought to dominate them. Arminius, their leader, emerged not only as a tactician, but as a symbol of the union of disparate tribes against a common foe. His genius lay not only in strategy, but in his ability to harness the forest, the land, and the anger of the people into an unstoppable force. The psychological ramifications for Rome were profound. Augustus, upon hearing the news, reportedly tore his hair and cried out for the lost legions, his grief mingling with rage and disbelief. The Roman Senate mobilized forces, fortified the Rhine frontier, and sought vengeance, but the boundaries of ambition had been redrawn. Germania beyond the Rhine was never fully conquered. The empire recognized the limits imposed not by armies, but by terrain, culture, and the cunning of those who knew the land better than any legionary. The legend of Teutoburg forest endured far beyond the practical military lessons. In Germania, Arminius became an immortal figure, celebrated in song and story, a hero who had defied the mightiest empire the world had seen. Rome, meanwhile, enshrined the event as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the proudest legions could be humbled by intelligence, terrain, and audacity. The battle became a touchstone in the narrative of empire, a stark lesson that power is not absolute, and that the wild, untamed world will always harbor surprises for those who underestimate it. Through centuries, historians and storytellers would return to Teutoburg, fascinated by its lessons and its human drama. Was it a result of Roman arrogance, Germanic unity, the genius of Arminius, or the sheer unpredictability of nature itself? Perhaps it was all of these. The forest, silent now, stands as a monument, a witness to courage, folly, and the eternal tension between ambition and limitation. Teutoburg Forest was more than a battlefield. It was a theater of human destiny. The blood spilled, the strategies executed, and the decisions made in those 3 fateful days shaped the trajectory of an empire. Rome learned humility, Germania tasted freedom. And the story, retold across generations, reminds all who hear it that even the mightiest can fall, and that the wilderness, whether of land, mind, or circumstance, can overturn the calculations of kings. The echoes of Teutoburg Forest did not end with the fall of Varus or the cries of dying legions. They lingered in the hearts of men, in the corridors of power in Rome, and in the songs whispered among the tribes of Germania. The forest, ancient and indifferent, had claimed its place in history not through conquest, but through cunning, courage, and the raw will of those who knew it best. It became more than a battlefield. It was a symbol, a mirror reflecting the ambitions and vulnerabilities of empires and the enduring spirit of freedom that can never be fully subdued. Arminius, the son of Germania who had walked the line between ally and traitor, became immortal in legend, a figure whose name conjured awe and respect. Rome, though humbled, endured, its legions rebuilt, its boundaries secured, its lessons engraved into the marrow of its military tradition. Yet the shadow of Teutoburg remained, a constant reminder that even the greatest power can falter when overconfidence meets the cunning of the determined and the wildness of the land. And the forest itself stands to this day, quiet and watchful, as if holding its breath, a witness to history's violent rhythms and the fragile triumphs of men. Its trees, its mud, its hidden ravines carry the memory of blood and strategy, betrayal and valor. To step among them is to step into a story that transcends time, a story of empires and freedom, of pride and humility, of men who dared to challenge fate itself. Teutoburg Forest is not just a tale of defeat. It is a meditation on power, cunning, and the eternal dialogue between humanity and the lands it seeks to dominate. It reminds us that even in the shadow of the greatest empire, in the dense silence of ancient woods, history is written in the blood of the fallen and the courage of the few. And as the wind stirs the branches, one cannot help but feel that the forest remembers, and that its story will never be forgotten.